book it up. But I'm just very, very thrilled and happy to see him after decades. I think the last time we met there when you were in the World Bank in Washington. Anjali Kumar, I think may have been around at that time.
Yes, sure.
When I saw you. So how long have you been out of the bank and in consulting?
Well, I left the World Bank in 1998, basically. But then I went to EBRD. But I only set up my own advisory firm or consulting about 2008. So kept an academic affiliation as well.
All right. Okay. So shall we begin?
Right. Yes.
Yeah. The Global Solutions Initiative students are unable to join us. We've got some teamwork. All right. So we can.
All right. Is it all right if I stand up?
Yes, do.
Yeah. I think otherwise.
We can hear you better too.
Yeah.
Although there are mics.
Yes. Okay. Well, thank you, Sudarshan.
Yeah, you need that for you are broadcasting this. You can put this in your pocket. Yeah. इसका ठीक कर दो.
Yeah. Okay, I'll take it. Thank you. All right, thank you very much, Sudarshan, and thanks for the invitation. So let's make this as informal as possible. So interrupt if you want, whether it's to disagree or to ask questions or the like. So I'm really happy to be here. I've never been to the Jinbo School before, and coming out here is a pleasure. Let me take that. I mean, this is the book I'm going to talk about, which I wrote with my old friend Saul Estrin from LSE, and it came out about a month ago, just over a month ago. It'll come out in America in early February, and it's called The Connections World, the Future of Asian Capitalism. And it's something that both of us turn to from having been working on very different things. He and I were actually working a lot in labor economics for a long time on unemployment and labor markets, and particularly in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. But we, in recent years, had started working, in my instance, again, on Asia, and in his instance, actually relatively new. So we came together, and the book was written during COVID days. So funnily enough, although COVID has been a bad experience for many people, actually COVID was a rather good experience, because I just sat in my office at the bottom of the garden and wrote this and didn't get distracted by other things. So the book has, the title tells the story. Oh, am I touching it? Is this me doing it? No? Okay. It tells the story. It has two parts: the connections world, which is really about the networks of politicians and businesses and the organizational forms that businesses take in this context. And the second part, it rather grandiosely is called The Future of Asian Capitalism. And what do we mean by Asia? Well, really the book is about what sort of finance types call emerging market Asia, what World Bank types call middle income Asia. So it's not really about Nepal or Laos or Cambodia, although many of the features that we have are present there. So it's really about the subcontinent, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Southeast Asia, and of course, East Asia, China. And we do include South Korea for reasons that are quite important for the argument, but we don't really spend any great time on Singapore or Taiwan, partly because they're small, partly because they're now relatively, well, genuinely quite rich countries, and partly, I think mainly because their size limits the generality of their models. So let me go to the arguments. And I'm going to try and basically keep it to about 30, 40 minutes, and then let's have discussion. So I'd be more than happy to learn from you rather than just to talk of it. So the book really asks a big question. Why has Asia been such a tremendous success? Because if you're from development economics, or if you're just interested in the future of the world, what is the most important thing that's happened in the last 60, 70 years? Well, of course, it's the renaissance of Asia, including this country, although incomplete. So the book asks, how did Asia start, as it were, reviving itself? What's likely to be its future? And what are the main fragilities and how can they be addressed? Now, I'm not going to go over much of what explains Asia's ascent, because a lot of that is really known. But what I want to point out is that Asia's extraordinary growth, and it's not just China. I mean, China has grown in really very powerful exponential ways, but it's round the board. This extraordinarily impressive growth has actually been achieved through a combination of policies and business configurations that are really very different from either what the rich world, in inverted commas, had when it started on its ascent, primarily in the 19th century, or what it has today. And therefore, it raises many, many questions as to both, in a public policy school, this must be of interest, what the role of policy is, as also if in terms of economics, when you think about what are the organizational and institutional formats that have been formed and have supported this extraordinary growth. And although I can't spend too much time on it right now, what we argue in the book is that the classical debate between market and state, some people basically say Asia's success is due to allowing the private sector to grow. Others say, Danny Roderick and others, that it's largely due because of state interventions, industrial policy in one form or the other. We argue that this distinction really misses the mark. Not because industrial policy hasn't been important, it most certainly has, particularly in South Korea, and to a different degree in China. In India, I would basically say industrial policy has largely been a massive failure, but that's another matter. But industrial policy and market is a false distinction. But actually, what has happened in this part of the world is whether the systems are socialist, so-called, or capitalist, richer, less rich, democratic, authoritarian in some form or the other, they appear to have ended up with very similar configurations of their economies. And in particular, the relationships that bind businesses to politicians and to government. And therefore, what we argue in the book is that there hasn't necessarily been an explicit adoption of industrial policy, but somehow or the other, there's been an implicit adoption or more tacit adoption of policies that have led to remarkably common outcomes. And those common outcomes, to summarize it, are in terms of the dominance in these economies of large business groups and their very close connections to political power, and the very transactional relationships that have been built up around them. So the common feature that spans from China to India to the smaller states of the region is pervasive and persistent networks of connections that link up business and politicians. So a significant part of the book is really looking at how you can measure and observe these networks. And then another part of the book looks at the consequences of these networks. Now, these ties are obviously not just there to make people feel good. They're there to confer benefits, and they do. And the benefits flow both ways, and they often have elements of reciprocity in them as well. And this is as true in this country as it is in Indonesia or even in China. And that's what we call this thing in red, the so-called connections world. And what, to finalize the summary, we argue is the connections world has not been an impediment to Asia's growth, but actually has been highly supportive of it. Mind you, most of that growth has been what, as economists, we call extensive growth, the accumulation of capital and labor, rather than necessarily growth through productivity increments or qualitative steps upwards. But, and this is the point when we look to the future, we argue that both that growth model and these arrangements that are connected to it are going to be much less positive in the future when countries have to rely on innovation and the sort of the economic turbulence that comes with innovation, whether as measured by the entry and exit of firms, failure, successes, the churning that, let alone in the case of the autocracies like China, or to some extent Vietnam, the ability to think freely, to be able to conduct and maintain research interests without fear or impediment, and indeed with property rights security. So in the future, we argue, the connections world will be a damn sight less supportive of Asia and therefore potentially far more disruptive. Now, personally speaking, some of that disruption may actually be a good thing because I'm not a great fan of authoritarian regimes, but in other cases, it may simply end up leading to a lot of disruption without necessarily converging to a democratic or pluralistic steady state. So those are some of the issues. So that's the big part of. Now, let's talk a little bit about the components of the connections world. So at the apex sit political parties and politicians, businesses, and in particular business groups. Come on in, you're welcome. Now, these interactions, as I mentioned, between these two lumps, as it were, are highly transactional. So politicians want firms or individuals to make campaign contributions, give them jobs to they or their family, or create jobs in their constituencies at, politically expedient moments. Companies, firms look to politicians for protection from foreign or domestic competition. It's no accident, after all, that in China, the trio of famous fintech and other companies, Tencent, Alibaba, Baidu, they compete with each other for sure, but they're all protected from the likes of Google, Apple, and the like. So they look for protection. They look sometimes for subsidies. That's an age-old story. People in this country are very familiar with that. They often get subsidies, not necessarily from the exchequer, from the finance minister, but often through state-owned banks, other conduits of that nature. Exactly, land. They look for loans, public sector contracts. We can think of many examples of that, and receipt of permits and licenses to operate. So really in India, I think we know very well that if you're into mining or anything that needs a permit or a license, you really can't avoid interacting with politicians, and these sorts of transactional games have to start. And some companies, I'm not going to actually go through the slide because you will know better than I do, but the most prominent current example, of course, is the Adani Group, basically have just about all of these things going on. Yeah, and that is very well reflected in its extraordinarily inflated equity price. Okay, now, oh, it's jumping a bit. Let me go back. Right. Now, what we argue is that these sorts of networks are highly adaptive, and so we use a bunch of new data, which I'll come to. They're very purposive, and they really amount to enormous amount more than just cronyism. There have been lots of very good books about cronyism. I mean, for instance, Min Jin Pei from the University of California, wrote a very good book about China's crony capitalism. And he basically looked at the relationships between party and state and companies and framed it in that. I think he, in a sense, missed a trick because actually it's much more pervasive. It's about networks of relationships rather than bilateral associations, which is more what the cronyism game is. And these webs of connections come together with common purpose and actually very common ways of working, as I've hinted at, and which we chronicle in the book. So although the book is written really from an economics perspective, we're not shy from using examples and even to some extent anecdotes. And even if we weren't shy, the reality is one would have to, because of course, all of these sorts of relationships are not just there to be observed. They're sometimes covert, they're sometimes hidden, and they're sometimes very hard to actually unfathom. Now, if these connections are common across, then the shape of these networks clearly does differ. And that is obviously affected by the political system and sorts of institutions. So let me put what is undoubtedly the most beautiful bit of the book, which are the network maps we have. So for each of the countries, we have, and this is a proprietary database that we worked with, which got through the World Bank, which essentially has lists of politicians, political parties, businesses, state-owned and private individuals, and looks at the connections between the two of them. These sorts of databases are often put together for the purpose of measuring the amount of so-called politically exposed persons. And they are important for investors and the like. But we realized that this sort of database was actually much richer and could be looked at to get out the relationships between individuals, businesses, and politicians. So what we have here is two network formats. So you wouldn't have to be a genius to understand which is China and which is India, because China, in a way, it's the most beautiful of the maps. It has a sort of cyclops eye, the party at the middle, and in the middle, doubtless, is Mr. Xi Jinping sitting there. And then around the politicians, then a whole rash of SOEs, but also a lot of, in the green, private firms, as well as the black private individuals. Now, there are about 85 to 90,000 so-called nodes or observations in there. So it's really almost impossible to pick up who's connected to whom. One can go in and work out who is, but I can assure you that many of the connections radiate out from that core to these different types of companies by ownership type, as well as different types of individuals. Here is India with the major parties. This data relates to 2018 or 2017, I can't remember which at this point. And there you can see again, a fair number of SOEs, less than in China, because obviously India's experience with SOEs has been so lamentable, and many of them are now failing or being closed down, mercifully perhaps. But you also have a fair number of private companies. And we have these maps for all of these countries. So what you can clearly see is the political institutional arrangements matter. So, by the way, if you looked at the Vietnam map, which is in the book, it's similar. It's not quite as centralized around the party, but it has a similar format. And of course, that's because they are places with a unique political party, i.e. their Communist Party. Now, these relationships have a feature which is actually, I won't say it's unique to Asia, but the depth of it is unique to Asia, and the consequences of it, the power of the consequences is unique to Asia. And that is that businesses in those frameworks, outside of the SOEs, tend to be at their apex, organized not as just standalone businesses in the sort of European, UK type way, or the US way for that matter, but as business groups. Now, I know there have been a lot of people who work in international business, sociology, who have looked at these business groups over time. For instance, people in Indonesia have been very well aware from, basically Suharto onwards, pre-Suharto, the importance of these groups, and often their ethnic dimensions, because in that part of the world, a lot of these business groups are actually Chinese run, or Chinese ethnicity, that is, rather than Chinese state. But business groups are extremely important in this, but they are not the same as conglomerates that we commonly talk about, General Electric or whatever, in the OECD. Business groups are mostly family run. They're often dynastic. Mr. Jindal, after all, is one of them, actually. They're often highly diversified, which is very unusual. They do lots of things, and things that you would not predict that they would do. They might have software companies, they might have manufacturing. I mean, again, if you look at Mr. Adani's group, which is very interesting because it's formed so recently, it's not actually a concentrated business. It's a highly diversified business because, in part, he has been able quite successfully to pick up assets through political connections and assemble this motley portfolio. But this is a feature right throughout Asia. It's not simply something that is operating in that instance or in this country.
You can add Tata's.
Yes, correct.
Two airlines.
Yes,
the range is
yes, absolutely. And Birla was also very similar. So most of these business groups have been very diversified. And I'll come in part to why. Now, all of them tend to have pyramidal ownership structures, which allow their owners, these families or individuals, to have levels of control that are far in excess of their degrees of actual ownership. And one consequence, of course, is that they normally do in minority shareholders, or at least put them in disadvantageous positions over time and when required. And these structures facilitate tunneling, owners move around resources within companies, and as Naveen and I were discussing over lunch, one of the consequences, of course, is that it's very hard to actually work out where they make profits, where they make losses, and the scale of both. So there's a lot of lack of transparency in all of this. But what they are there to do is to acquire assets, control them, and control them in the interests of the dominant group or dominant part of the business group, which is the family. Now, these business groups not only operate like this, and pretty much across all of these countries. There's some nuance with regard to China. We can deal with that in the discussion. But they also have another feature, which is that they're very good at entrenching market power. By the way, it's not the case that in sectors where business groups are there, that others don't enter. They do. And sometimes they even compete quite fiercely, but not many enter. So I'll give an example in the book, which is the Philippines. Now, I don't know that much about the Philippines, but all my Filipino friends tell me that they're basically 6 or 7 families and their entities, these highly diverse companies that control the economy. Now, in the recent presidency of this fellow Duterte, a sort of glorified thug, to put it not too unkindly, another actually Chinese origin businessman, Dennis Uy, entered, formed a group, acquired a telecom company, again, highly diversified group, and forced his way in. So now they're probably, instead of 7 families, they're 8. But he didn't actually displace any of the existing 7. So it's not as if there's just a finite pie to be cut up. The pie can be expanded, and a certain amount of new entrants can be allowed, but not many. Okay, Now, why are these business groups like this? Well, they're like this in part for a variety of reasons, some of which have economic underpinnings and are more understandable than others, and some of which are really much more about political economy. The first is that they may actually help address missing or incomplete markets. So if you don't have ready access to finance, you get it in. If you don't have access to a pool of good management, you keep it in. It was probably no accident that Tata's was the first company that really formed a professional cadre of management back, I think, in the 50s, actually. It started out. So missing markets may be part of it. And in a sense, in inverted commas, that's the good side of the argument. But they also are there for another reason, which is that they provide very nice ways by which politicians can connect to them. They're highly centralizing, if you think about it. Let's say I'm a politician and Sudarshan is the owner of a business group, many types of companies and the like. I can simply go to him, I can transact with him, deal with it, and it may have wider ramifications and consequences. The second point, which we stress a little bit in the book, which I think is quite interesting, is from the point of view of these business group owners, this is a format that's very useful for them, not just for entrenching themselves and for boosting their profitability, but also ensuring their survival. Because when you're highly diversified and complex, it's very hard for any politician to predate on you. So let's say you are in favor with the party in power, and then you lose favor, so you wonder whether you're actually going to be penalized. And you then get a new government that comes in, it's actually very hard for them to actually penalize because of these webs of interconnections and non-transparent relationships. So there's tremendously good insurance, and therefore these factors come together. Now, the consequences of all of this are, I'm going to come to, but perhaps one of the most striking consequences is that they centralize wealth and business power in remarkably few hands. So I'll come to wealth first and then look at a measure of economic or business power. Just to give you a sense, Samsung accounts for over 20% of South Korea's GDP, one company. Now, Samsung is made up of many affiliates and subsidiaries, but basically one big holding company accounts for over a fifth of South Korea's GDP. In Thailand, the consolidated Kiaravanont group, CP Group, again, an ethnic Chinese group as it happens, their wealth exceeds 25 billion, rising, not as big a share of the economy as Samsung's, but also with family members highly active in politics. And there are plenty of other examples, and we bring in that. This is the slide on Adani. I'll pass over it because you will know much more than I do. Now, look at the explosion in wealth that has occurred. And by and large, most of these billionaires, assuming that this is well measured, this is probably as well measured as it can be, but there are going to be large degrees of error here. Most, if not all, of these billionaires are the owners and controllers of business groups, okay? So look at just in China, this massive explosion from something like 100 in 2000 to approaching 400 in 2020, rising. India, no, I beg your pardon. From China had 0 measured billionaires in 2000 and now has near on 400. India had a handful in 2000 and now has something a bit over 100. So that, by the way, is actually true in just about every other country in the region. Look at even at Vietnam. And these, by the way, there are about 3 or 4 really major business groups, including several actually owned by and run by women, one of whom, Madame Thao, has now endowed an Oxford College. So Linacre College is going to be Thao College because she gave them 300 million. So when you next go to Mr. Jindal, be sure to ask for at least 300 million. Anyhow, I'm being facetious, of course, but you can see that there's been an enormous explosion of wealth. So a lot of Asia's, not a lot, but a significant part of Asia's expansion, economic and financial expansion, has been captured by relatively few people. And here we're talking wealth, not income. Okay, we'll put income aside at the moment. Now, the second feature I want to stress, and I'm going to accelerate a little bit, is that it's not just about the massive accretions of wealth to relatively small numbers of businesses and individuals, but it's also what I call the attenuation of competition. So not only are these business groups very good at building their financial resources, but they're tremendously, and this is related, of course, they're remarkably good at building market power. Now, ideally, you know, if you want to measure market power, by the way, a very good example is Thomas Philippon's book on the US. You want to use a bunch of measures. You want to look at profits, you want to look at market share, and so on and so on. Actually, for this part of the world, looking at profit, impossible, for some of the reasons I mentioned and we discussed over lunch, Naveen and I. So we're left with very few indicators that you could use. But the indicator that we do use is simply concentration. And this is a measure that he uses for the US as well. So take a look at this. This is the so-called CR5 on the left, and this is so-called concentration ratio for 10. And they're the top 5 listed and unlisted, top 10 listed and unlisted firms in each country, okay? And what we are measuring, by the way, listed and unlisted firms here, what you've got in this are mixes of state-owned enterprises and private companies, almost all of which are business groups, in business parts of business groups, okay? So I'm not distinguishing, we could, between SOEs and private business groups in this, but one could. But as it happens, our argument is that these two things are in a sense the flip sides of the same coin. Now, look at this. If you look at the United States, then the revenue of these, the aggregated revenue of these top 5 relative to GDP is no larger than about 3%, okay? Now, of course, if you do it by sector, you get lots more concentration. So that's part of Philippon's argument. If you look at software and other tech-heavy sectors, then you get it. But what is so extraordinary, striking, is that in a place like South Korea, 30%, the revenues of the top 5 companies, which obviously includes Samsung, Hyundai, and others, accounts for about 30% of GDP. In Vietnam, it's more like 36%. And even in India and China, the two behemoths, it's north of, well, it's about 12, 13%. And if you shift over to the top 10, then India and China are inching towards 20%. South Korea is north of 40, and Vietnam, unbelievably, is about 45%. So as a measure of concentration, this suggests that very significant amounts of market power have been accumulated and entrenchment with it. Now, what are the consequences of this economic landscape that, as I've described it? Just to go back, a landscape where politicians, political parties, and businesses are connected, where businesses have really 2 very big bits. One are the state-owned enterprises, particularly in the so-called socialist economies. The other is these mostly privately held business groups. Well, one consequence is that, and again, we discussed this a little bit over lunch, is that the so-called dual economy, which has been in the literature since one of the first Nobel Prize winners, Arthur Lewis, and others have wrote about it in the 50s. The dual economy structure has been maintained. And what you basically get is that there are a very small number of jobs that are created and sustained in both SOEs and the business groups. Many of them, by the way, are really good jobs. If you can get in there, you get well paid, you're productive, everything's fine. But the problem is not many of them. Yep. So large bits of these economies, and it's not just India, it's as true, by the way, of China and Vietnam as it is of India. Most of these economies are still marooned in the informal economy, which is huge, and the firm size distribution as a consequence has a highly pyramidic form with a massive bunching at the bottom in terms of firm size, a middling part of the economy, which often struggles to grow, and a relatively very small part that is large firms. Now, over lunch, Naveen pointed out that some of that is sort of a little bit artificial, because if regulations kick in when you have more than 20 employees, it will affect the thresholds. But by and large, I think this characterization is right, not just for India, but for all of these economies. And what that means is that relatively few, in inverted commas, good jobs get created, and most jobs are poorly paid and very low productivity. So a recent World Bank report that looked at labor productivity on average, mean labor productivity relative to so-called OECD, i.e. sort of Canada, US, Europe, and the like, labor productivity in Asia is still only between 10 and 15%. So a massive gap that will need to be closed over time. Now, this, I think, is perhaps where some of the implications of the structures and relationships that I've described comes to bear the most. Because as I pointed out, I think it's probably an unexceptional argument. The idea of simply relying on more capital, labor, the extensive growth model has pretty much reached its limits. Most starkly in China, of course, where there really is no labor surplus at all to be drawn on, and where wages are rising strongly as a consequence, and where even policymakers for the last 5 years have recognized that in their strategic and 5-year plans. Now, Asia's growth, in other words, will have to shift towards innovation and invention. But the consequences of this for that are not actually always bad. I don't want to say this is a lousy arrangement for innovation. It isn't. Because actually in an accompanying paper, we look, insofar as we can, given the limitations of the data, many of these business groups are really quite innovative. They're not shy about innovating, whether it be by bringing in new technology, whether it be by managerial improvements. By most measures, they do innovate. The problem is that they form a relatively limited part of the total economy, and outside of these groups, most companies simply do not innovate, either because they don't have access to the resources or the knowledge to do so, or because, in fact, they're actively impeded from doing so. So what it means is, I think it's rather like having a large banyan tree under which not much grows, really. And the starkest example of that, of course, is in South Korea. And this is, by the way, an issue that is highly, well, not only relevant, but very much on the minds of South Korean policymakers, whether of the right or the left. They all recognize that a company like Samsung is highly innovative and very dynamic, and has pretty much since day one worked under the market discipline of trading and investing in international markets. But they also recognize the dangers of having so much concentrated in just one group, and the inability to have a richer ecology of firms. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, the problem outside of the democracies or broadly pluralistic regimes in places like in China in particular, of course, is that the incentives for invention and innovation, or the key preconditions for it, which is the ability to think freely, to experiment, to fail, to do things that are not familiar, those are to some extent compromised, of course, by the political arrangements. And to give an example, a very interesting paper by an economist, one of them, a colleague at LSE, looked at recent Chinese investment in artificial intelligence, into which they're putting massive resources. It's stipulated in their 5-year plan and strategic documents, and they're following through on it. But one of the most fascinating aspects is that the finance which the Chinese state is making available for AI is largely going to companies that are doing AI in areas that correspond to their political interests. And what are those? Security, facial recognition, and the like. So one of the large grants was received by Huawei, which is clearly a politically connected company, whether there's just no denying that. And what was it for? It was the facial recognition of Uyghurs. Okay? So you can see that even in those sorts of systems, when they understand what the potential drivers of innovation are, or even the areas from which innovation come about, the political directives may in turn skew that and give it a direction that may not be anything near optimal or let alone desirable from an ethical or political perspective. Okay, so it's really not that these big business groups and the like are innovative, but the economies as a whole aren't that innovative. And so we have some scatters here. So this relates in logs, GDP per capita against R&D, which is, a standard measure of innovation. And you can see that many Asian countries that we have there, India, Pakistan, China, Vietnam, and like, lie around the line, whether above or below. The only one that lies significantly above, of course, is South Korea, and then a bunch lie below that. And if one had data from Malaysia and the like, my guess is that they would probably be sitting in there. So most Asian economies are around or a bit below R&D levels for their level of development. So this is controlling for the level of GDP. So Asia is not an exemplar in innovation. It may be an exemplar in growth over the last 50, 60 years, but it's not an exemplar in innovation, okay? Now, the other thing, of course, and we can come back to it in the discussion, whenever you get going with, say, particularly Chinese policymakers or people in and around government, they say, oh, well, what about our patenting? It's just fantastic. We're producing endless numbers of patents. Well, I'll come to that because most of those patents are fairly meaningless as it happens. So look at patents that may be of some quality. So patents that are lodged in multiple jurisdictions, including in foreign jurisdictions. So in other words, where the costs of patenting are likely to also be some reflection of likely payoffs to it. And there you can see, again, with the exception of South Korea, which lies way above the line, most of Asia, including China, is at or below the line and often quite far down it as well. Okay, so let me wrap up. I've gone on too long. I think we argue in the final chapter, in chapter 7, that the connections world has been probably in its way a boon for Asia. I mean, it has been a feature of its growth model and quite a successful aspect of it. But if you want to go towards innovation, and if you want to go towards a different productivity enhancing path, the connections world, with its entrenchments, with its inefficiencies, with its rent taking and the like, and its accretion of large amounts of inequality, whether in wealth, but also in income. Because remember, from the employment structure that I've just described, if you're in a good company, you get good wages. But the majority of people are in not very good companies and get very low wages. So you have relatively high levels of income inequality as well as wealth inequality. But so we need to deal with the power of the connections world. And the reality is it's not going to go away. It's not going to lie down and say, okay, well, I've had my day. Let's go to a different type of arrangement. There's no philanthropy involved here. They're well entrenched. They won't fade away naturally. And both sides to the game, whether it's politicians or whether it's businesses, have an interest in perpetuating these types of arrangements. And so it will really need the adoption of explicit policies to deal with the connections world. Whether they will be adopted, we don't really say in the book. My guess is that most governments will be highly resistant. But having said that, let's think very briefly, and then I'll end, as to what those policies might be. And here we basically make the arguments, and we can discuss them in more detail. We need really changes to corporate governance to break up those sort of pyramid type relationships, to empower minority shareholders, and basically to introduce far greater transparency in the ownerships of companies and in their company structures. Now, that's easier said than done. One way, which has been tried in many countries with varying degrees of success, is simply through prohibitions. But you don't have to be a libertarian to know that prohibitions often don't work. However, they can work. By the way, I mentioned at the beginning that business groups pretty much don't exist in the so-called advanced economies. Well, they did exist, but in the States, in the US that is, in 1932-33, Roosevelt, as part of the New Deal, basically outlawed business groups, and that killed it. In the UK, we had a couple of business groups, and they were essentially done away with through tax and other changes in the 60s and 70s. So in the so-called rich world, these sorts of arrangements are quite rare. So prohibitions can work, but the ability of these parties to circumvent them should not be underestimated. So you can prohibit pyramid structures, cross-holdings. You can put prohibitions on the numbers of subsidiaries, which, by the way, Modi's government did I think back in 2015. And you can also take on board a whole lot of measures to stop related party transactions, which are a key part of these arrangements. But they are quite hard to enforce. The Koreans, by the way, have tried prohibitions of cross-holdings and other forms going back over the last 20, 25 years. And they realized it didn't really work because the Samsungs of this world were far too adept at getting around them. So other forms that can have more punch, if you like, are changes in taxation. For instance, levying additional tax liabilities through corporate taxation when you have a business group structure. Now, there are nuances to it. You don't want to do it if the business group is young and growing, but if it's been around for a long time, established, then you might want to levy additional taxation on it. And that can be quite effective. You can also target policies on dividends, and perhaps the most effective thing, again, from South Korean experiences, you can introduce inheritance taxes. The thing that is probably likely to break up Samsung as a business group and certainly disrupt the family dynastic element is the fact that an inheritance tax of 40%, a bit under the Japanese level of 50%, has been imposed in the last couple of years. And in fact, the current head of the Samsung family, who, by the way, has just been released from jail for corruption for about the third time, this character has announced that he will not be passing on management ownership of the company to his heirs in the future. And part of the reason is his father, who died a couple of years ago, had to pay an inheritance tax bill of more than 20 billion. So actually, inheritance taxes can be an enormously effective format. And in India, as we know, there is no inheritance tax. I mean, that's something that maybe should be considered. The second thing, third thing or fourth thing is competition policy. You know, there's a whole huge literature, there's a whole sub-industry of economists who work on competition policy, and they normally start off looking by sector or activity and the like. Actually, we argue that's very valuable and important, but you could also simply look at market structure and moves to limit market shares in aggregate, as for instance with the concentration measure. And by the way, there is quite an interesting example of that, and that comes from Israel, where they had some business groups, but where they realized that both targeting through tax and also looking at the level of concentration in the economy as a whole was an appropriate way of trying to deal with market power. And the final bit, which a little bit hand-waving, is the need, obviously, for greater transparency. And this, above all, relates to the other side of the coin, not the businesses so much, but the recipients of these, which is the politicians and political parties. And this is an immensely difficult thing to know. I mean, colleagues of mine in the World Bank spent years trying to work out best practice and went round. And I don't know that anything hugely has been achieved. There are some templates. I quite like the one we have in the UK, but I recognize that it hasn't actually even been particularly successful at home, let alone abroad, which is that you have to have asset and interest declarations for any public officials. Just to give you a measure of how difficult this may be, I believe in Pakistan, there is parliamentarians, MPs, have to declare their assets and interests. And in 2017 or thereabouts, not a single one had owned up to having any assets, not a single one. So you can see what a difficult proposition this is. But unless there's some progress made in this, the other side of the coin will not be dealt with. So I hope that's covered enough. I've gone on far too long, I'm sorry. But
Right, clear. When we're talking, it occurred to me there was a period when Mrs. Gandhi got elected in 1971 on the slogan of Garibi Hatao. Right, the first time in a general election was poverty an issue. And most Indian general elections it's not. And then she took on this economic populism, attacked. So it became a household word. If somebody wanted to chastise somebody for being a big uppity, the lady of the house would say, "Oh, do you think you're a Tata or a Birla?" So Tata and Birla became, emblematic of this power of the big business. And here was Mrs. Gandhi attacking them, nationalize the banks, and so on. Right now, I wondered, where that kind of a narrative in terms of political change would fit in. I mean, she did away with the privy purses of the rulers, so big business was bad, forced the banks, nationalized banks to lend to farmers and small enterprises and so on. So that's happened. I mean, it didn't do much good for India's growth, but there was a spell when it happened. So that could happen in a democracy, don't it? I mean, it's because in the end, these businessmen, they laid their bets, right? So it doesn't matter for the Jindal group, whether it's the Congress or the Samajwadi Party or Naveen Patnaik or BJP, who've got their bases covered. But still, there could be a phase where suddenly, everybody goes on saying big business is bad. I mean, that's the slogan of the opposition right now in India. Now, we don't know whether it will catch on or not catch on, but that the BJP is beholden to Adani and the big corporates is what the opposition is saying. So I just wondered if you have some sense of the durability of these arrangements, these connections in democratic polities where there's so many parties, so many actors, regional parties and so on, whether that can continue.
well, that's a very big question, but what we found in the book is, in many ways, the distress is that these business groups are just simply very persistent. You may be a business group in Indonesia in the Suharto era, Salim Group, others. I mean, you know Indonesia probably much better than I do. And you look today, those business groups are all there. I mean, and that was when you had a radical shift, a step shift in political arrangements. You got the ousting of Suharto, and then you got the gradual movement towards a sort of pluralistic system. Now, there were a few confiscations, but very, very few. And almost all those players are powerful, in situ, undisturbed right now. So, you know, just hoping that something, a political shock of that nature will achieve some of these outcomes that we think we desire is just the fact that that wasn't possible at all. And it hasn't been possible elsewhere, suggests that there's far too much resilience in it. It needs another way of thinking. Personally speaking, if I were a politician, which I'm not, thank God, and don't ever intend to be, but if I was, and I wanted to go against this, I think I wouldn't be going around saying big business is bad. I'd be going around saying, let's have more big business rather than just having my friends and your friends' big business. And so, in other words, sort of, you know, expanding access to the cake rather than just simply saying, I don't like you because you're Tata or you're Birla or Goenka or whatever, because we know where that leads. Normally, nothing happens. And insofar as it happens, you then allocate it to someone you do like, who might be an Ambani or an Adani or something of that nature. So it just gets, the chairs get rearranged.
Let me ask, I will have to leave just a few minutes before. For I would assume, Simon, that these policy options, the policy objective is human and social development. That's why you have these stuff, right?
Yes, but it's also economic development as such. I mean, as measured by productivity and growth. So okay. I think it's not narrower.
Yeah, fair enough. But the growth side is great already. The contribution to growth of the BGs. That's doing fantastic.
Probably, yes, insofar as one can accurately measure it, yes.
Right. So the two things I wanted to ask, one is the work done by Douglas North and others, both in his early days, but also in his later days in closed access society.
Yes, yes, of course.
And the issues of inequality that arise from this kind of exclusivity, the social exclusion, all of that stuff, the negative impacts on human development, all of that. If we can find a way to have the positive contributions of these SOEs and BGs and get them to work beyond the typical progressive taxation and so on, which is the usual redistributive mechanisms. But some alternative way in which you have a kind of what is sometimes called heterarchy, you know, the sort of the meta-governance between state and the non-government and non-state actors, self-organizing and growing together. I think might be a policy option that we need to look into more deeply. The issue that I'm really thinking about is how do we maybe it's not the what of the policy so much as the how. And how, so the question then is, how do you craft policies which are evolutionary, which are adaptive, which are flexible, so that you have the capacity to learn and for the policies to grow with changes that you observe. I think if you assume upfront a kind of a deterministic world in which you make the policy and then you will get ABC results and leave them for 5 years or something. I think you're very likely to screw up.
I agree.
And so it's the how then might be of the policy, even how you monitor and evaluate and what you look for. I wondered whether you guys thought a little bit about the how and what did you come up with beyond the what of the policy.
Yes. Well, I think we did. Whether we did it successfully will be for you and others who might read the book to judge. But I think in a way, what I was trying to hint at that, it seems to me that, going back to your example of Douglas North and closed access and the like, and the nature of the institutional arrangements, and that argument then sort of segued into Acemoglu and Robinson, and their very sort of broad brush distinction between, in inverted commas, what's good and what's bad, extractive versus inclusive institutions, and their inability, basically, I think, to answer the question of how you get from one bad equilibrium to a better equilibrium, partly because these are such large baskets into which they're put. We felt that was to be eschewed and to put an aside. These were levels of characterization that weren't susceptible to policy treatment. And this obviously must be on your mind as a public policy school. So that is why I think we thought that these are actually quite granular and they are susceptible to experimentation. Because I think the thing about policy is that in very rare cases, do people suddenly go and adopt a policy like a eureka moment that solves the problem at hand. It's normally done in a horribly messy, iterative and changing format. I think you might agree with that.
Well, nationalizations are done suddenly.
They are, but most of them end up in tears.
Tears, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
That's my worry.
Yes. So I think we're not really we're talking about changes in corporate governance codes, in legal arrangements, with the caveat that so far many of them have not proven effective, and then experimentations with taxation. After all, in the example I gave you, it's taken the South Koreans probably 30 to 35 years to work out that you couldn't crack the problem of the chaebols, of Samsung and the like, through bans on cross holdings, bans on subsidiaries and the like, because they got round them. So the thing that they're finally alighted on is this inheritance tax thing. And even that is it's going to motivate the business group owners to change their structures, but it probably would have to be accompanied by other things as well. But that's a long run experimental process. And you have to wonder why they couldn't get to that quicker, but that's the case. Similarly, I think I would say those are the main. Competition policy also. I mean, here it's like a great big hole, isn't it? I mean, almost all of these economies, including here, have competition agencies. Yes. And we know that they are largely toothless. Huh? And they're toothless because of several things. One, they may be politically connected and therefore not have to be circumscribed in what they can do. Two, because they often don't have enough staff with the right technical qualifications. Three, they don't have the institutional backup to try and get their decisions to legal outcomes that would enforce them. But the fourth point that I make is that it's often because they're looking at competition through the wrong lens. They're basically taking the lens that operates in, say, North American competition policy, which is to look at market power by relatively disaggregated activities, whereas actually there's something much simpler that could be targeted, which is just simply the concentration. Now, that's only going to get you some way, but it might be better to start there than rather than pretending that you're going to replicate, say, UK or US competition policy, which we also know has many limitations too. Hi.
Yes, thank you very much.
apart from the how of policy, that is going back to solve central questions and also complex adaptive systems approach. I would rather like to raise a very specific issue. You see that in finance, there is a very interesting literature on risk shifting. And maybe kind of there's a huge development there that maybe banking industry, for example, the risk is shifted from one shareholder or say from shareholders to depositors, and through which there's a lot of like systemic risk created in the economic networks.
Yeah.
So I was just looking at these tunneling effects that you have in the book, and it seems to be very interesting. But here it is more complex, it seems, because of the network between the politics and the business groups, which are also different from conglomerates in a way that you just mentioned. So how would you like to look into this risk shifting literature? Is there any kind of implications for this network on risk and then giving rise to systemic risk? That is one point. And the second is again going back to Professor Singh's point that in a complex adaptive systems approach, we also talk about uncertainty. And uncertainty actually goes back to say Knightian uncertainty in economics, which is like more fundamental. So how then this kind of networks might work or might change in that kind of scenario?
Yeah.
Measures.
Well, those are very good questions. And I think risk shifting, I think the way we deal with it in the book is actually rather simple, maybe almost too simplistic. I mean, we basically think of the financial component as having, in this context, having two aspects. One is the ability of these business groups to organize their financing, either internally, and that can be a missing markets type of interpretation. You know, they set up their own pocket banks or sometimes arm's length type funding arrangements. And the second, of course, is that they, through their networks and connections to politicians, arrange financing from state-owned banks or other entities on terms that are preferential to them and probably carry degrees of risk far higher than is reflected in the interest rate and the pricing option that they have.
Has increased its stake in Adani group of companies, sixfold in the last few months.
Yes, and there you can see obviously systemic risk thing. Having said that, I think it's probably a shortcoming of the book that we don't go in any great detail to that. We just sort of genuflect in the right direction. But yes, that's certainly an aspect. I mean, look, to put it in very broad brush terms, it's probably no accident that the two places that have had the largest and repeated recapitalizations of their banking systems, financial sectors, have been this country and China. And it's no accident because much of that has, some of it has been, giving loans to farmers that aren't repayable and the like, but an awful lot of it has been lending to interested or related parties in ways that don't reflect this. So I'm sorry, it's not an adequate answer to your question, which is very interesting, but it's something.
So you've given a whole bunch of policy options, which again take us back to our legacy of regulation in India, where most of the efforts of the large businesses was who uses those regulations as entry barriers for others. For example, there's this book called The Polyester Prince, where they look at how Mukesh Ambani's polyester business grew, and that was on top of, they essentially used the regulatory arrangements to eke out Bombay Dyeing, who had competing technologies.
Yes, sure.
So all of these can be used by these big businesses to get more market share, create barriers, rather than reduce barriers. And essentially, for example, Reliance in 2014 used anti-dumping duties to be placed on some of the chemical intermediaries that's used in polyester, which
Sure.
led to a significant increase in concentration in the markets.
Yes.
In the 6 years after that, and that has had trickle-down effects on more smaller businesses downstream.
Yes.
So the growth of big businesses have come at the cost of the smaller guys being pushed out, their margins
Yes.
being
Sure.
being pressed, and they becoming uncompetitive in the larger world markets.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how they can be better for the country in general. And the second is exactly the Ambani and Adani difference. Sorry, to say it like that. And you rightly put it, the Adani group is not adding capital. They're actually acquiring strategic assets.
Right.
On the other hand, if big businesses use their market power to add capital and absorb labor, then that would be a different outcome altogether. Now, how do you push policies to, how do you push public policy to, if you're saying that big businesses are good, how do you prevent the big businesses from just acquiring strategic assets rather than, how do you get them to add to the capital pool, add to innovation rather than just acquiring innovative firms? How do you get them to do that is another question. Can I press on a bit more?
Yeah, sure.
Right. So the other question was in the networks charts that you put up, there were a lot of individual nodes on the India chart. What explains that? You don't see that in China. You see the red, the blue, and the greens. You don't see a lot of black as you see in India. What probably is going on in there?
Sure.
And about the dualism in the labor market, it makes sense, right? So there are these few nice jobs, and you have a large labor pool working towards those jobs in the hope for that, so you can extract
Yes.
more out of the labor of that surplus pool. And then I was looking at the labor productivity that you showed. You said that it was 15% of the OECD. Wouldn't that be expected, because OECD has been exporting the labor-intensive, low productivity manufacturing to Asia? For example, if you look at apparel, apparel in India has only marginally higher output per worker compared to agriculture. So that would be pretty much expected. Yeah, I think that's what I meant.
Yes.
Anybody else before you answer?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's take over there.
So I would like to bring in a societal aspect to this discussion, which is that continuing your discussion on Samsung in South Korea. The level of prestige attached to Samsung and similar companies like Hyundai and all is pretty much equivalent to what we attach to the civil service jobs, the UPSC here in India. So, I mean, Samsung has its own, like we have the SAT, Samsung has its own aptitude, Samsung aptitude test. So God sake. So it is a very prominent test, Samsung aptitude test, and people of my age often end up giving that test. So the topic of discussion is like how do we even bring upon this collective will to as I'm with you, by the way, increasing the number of big businesses instead of having no big businesses or breaking them down. But that requires some policy implementation, and because of first their political connections, and second the prestige that is attached, especially in places like Japan, in terms of like Toyota, or in South Korea for Samsung. These companies, how is it even possible? How is it possible to bring about that societal will to bring about more big businesses. So that is my question about the societal aspect rather than the political or economic side of things.
I mean, noted them, no? So we go around and then. you can-
Yeah, no, sure. Yeah, yeah.
As a commander, thank you so much for your presentation. I have one small methodological question and another one. How did you measure the institutional and the political support? And what was the time period of the study? These are the two small things. Maybe I should get
Say that again. How did I measure?
the institutional or the political support for these business groups, if I'm reading it correctly. And what was the time period of the study?
Okay.
It seems that democratization and development are generally the larger theory are positively related, but when it comes to Asia, because of the concentration aspect, it seems that the countries which are higher concentration are developed, but many of them are not highly democratic. So, and you are questioning the tenability and the success of such a policy. So, when do you think at the tipping point can it shift to the other side and becomes it becomes problematic for those countries?
Go ahead.
Right, so thank you very much for this talk. I was a little more excited about this results of networks. So I have seen that it has some level of hierarchy and some level of communities as well into that structure. And maybe there's scaling into that. Some phenomena that is governing the scaling into that network. And then another thing would be because of that hierarchy, the information goes from bottom to top and policy comes from top to bottom. So that's where complexity will come. But
Sure.
third thing is that I just want to know about the structure of that network. That it is because of the inherent structure of the data, or is it because of the practical algorithm that we use?
Yeah.
Anyone else? Well. Yes.
So,
Yeah.
this is my observation and then framed it as questions as well. So Tata, Birla, or let's say Jindal, Peter Group, Godrej, these groups were around, but quite a long time. But India did not actually grew during that period. It was only a Hindu growth rate, a very minimal growth happened during that period. And in fact, this whole story of India's growth or double-digit growth or whatever you want to say is a very lucid phenomenon. And it started to trigger off post-liberalization. That's number one. The second is none of the developing countries are innovators. So whether you take Pakistan or let's say any, like 80% of the R&D is being done by G7 countries, right? So I was a little bit, surprised to see that diagram figure where all the developing countries are there as an innovator. So because in any case they have a very minor share and they are mostly there's some leapfrogging going on in terms of growth to some extent. And my third point is, do you think that a further financial market development can be, something, a must condition in order to break this, other than a policy recommendation, direct policy, rather than which you frame it up here. But what about the role of the local financial market? Okay, because still now you will see, like any of these developing countries, the financial market capitalization is nowhere near to the developed or advanced economies. And finally, these type of nexus, it's definitely not we want to see in a developed economy, right? You don't get to see much. So do you think poverty, income inequality, and corruption, these are actually the three major reasons, if we dig it deep and go beyond the factors of production, say capital and labor, and we head towards, let's say, these type of variables, do you see like poverty, income inequality, and corruption has some, as a, I think like these are the necessary ingredients. I was thinking, are these necessary ingredients for this type of nexus which we have got to see here? Thank you.
Okay. Gosh, that's a very rich menu of things. So I'll probably have to go quite quickly through them, but thank you very much. Maybe go from the last first, as it were. I mean, the 3 points that you raise, in a way, the one that I find the most interesting is, as you rightly say, business groups were around before. After all, Tata's was formed back in the 19th century, and they came about. And indeed, business groups were an integral part of the license Raj, as we know. I mean, there's so many examples of this. So there's no doubt that how business groups perform, and even to some extent what they look like, will depend a lot on the overall business environment. So if you have a regime that prioritizes protectionism, national champions, and other sort of goals of that nature, you probably will end up with a lot of rent seeking, yeah, and that mechanism. But I think in a way, what's more interesting is that these groups were able to adapt and develop, and mostly to survive and even entrench when the policy game changed and when there was a greater degree of liberalization under Vajpayee and others, and then Manmohan Singh and so on. So it's an extremely adaptable format. But I suppose the point I'm trying to make, if you want to do it in the Indian context, is that once you have skin in the game, it's not very often that you end up being out of the game altogether. There's some enormous incumbency advantage. And I'm not quite sure how it exists. I mean, in a way, I wish I was an anthropologist or sociologist. One probably ought to go along and interview all the Birlas and the others who probably don't run cutting edge businesses, but still survive, and work out how they do. But that, I think, is something that comes up. Now, that's another point. When we launched the book back in October at the LSE, we had a very interesting discussion, and a couple of people said, okay, well, I buy your argument with business groups, but what explains the fact that you have business groups in Latin America, but they're absolutely hopeless, really? And Latin America doesn't really achieve growth. What's the difference? Is it really the business groups, or is it other things? And I suppose my answer goes back to what I'm trying to say to you now, is that it's this interaction. It's not just that this organizational format exists in limbo. It exists in connection to overall policy and other institutions. And it's highly adaptable and can be highly dynamic. Or if given the right context, they can just be a bunch of lotus eaters. No? Now, that's the last point. Someone mentioned political systems. The chances are that they are lotus eaters is probably much higher when you have a personalized autocracy. So I would guess Cambodia fits that pretty well with Mr. Hun Sen and people around him. I can think of many examples from earlier work that I did in Central Asia, a place like Azerbaijan, a local dynastic despot, and a few people around that. So there's the types of outcomes that come from business groups obviously do depend a lot on conditions that are external to them, that are not orthogonal, and these may be of a policy-based nature. But there's a really very good questions. On developing countries innovation, you're right, by and large, developing countries don't innovate a lot. They do a lot of process innovation, product much less. But I go back to the fact that China does innovate a great deal, actually. Now, patents are not a good measure because patents are there in the plan. So if you're a business in China, you're going to report lots of patent applications because it will, the planner, the state will like it. The number of patents actually granted, even in China, is a small fraction of the number that are applied for. And even then, you know, a lot of those are concentrated in some of these big business groups. So that's why we use high quality patents. But if you were to look at it, I would say that although the picture is far less positive than the Chinese government would naturally like to portray, China is probably the one middle income country that has a serious chance of being able to innovate, and may even be innovating right now, albeit in ways that are skewed by the priorities of the principle. Yeah, okay. But yeah, actually a friend of mine from Brazil said, I buy your argument, but if only we could have Indian business groups in Brazil, we might have achieved something. But I think that's slightly making a mistake with the causality. Your question on networks, yes, those are quite technical issues that we can come back and discuss it afterwards. On the maps, the scaling, we basically weight by the number of ties. Yeah, and that's the key characteristic of it. Do we have measures of political institutions and support? Not really. We have these mappings of networks, of players within them, but actually much of the discussion in the book uses other evidence, including, you know, more like case study evidence, because simply unpacking those sorts of relationships is not as if you can go to a drawer, pull it out and see that, you know, Sudarshan has been interacting with X, Y, and Z and got this and that. It's all camouflaged, it's non-transparent and the like. So you have to put it together in another way. So that's a shortcoming, but I don't think it's for a lack of effort, but it's. In terms of the overall characterization of the network, well, I suppose you would you could see that it was well, they vary. I mean, some are more diffuse than others. Some are more are denser. But I don't have an overall characterization because they vary country by country. So what we have there is simply a mapping of the nodes weighted by the number of links coming off those nodes for these types of players. And the question that was also asked was, why are there more private individuals in India than there are in China? It's actually largely about politics, because I suspect if it were properly measured in China, a lot of those that come up as red, i.e. politicians, would in effect be private individuals. So we know that a lot of Chinese party officials are Communist Party officials, are basically acting as profit maximizers, as private individuals in that. So that's a measurement thing that keys off the political system. Gosh, there's so many things here. You're right, prestige. Yeah, how do you shake it up? But prestige is quite a dynamic thing. I mean, if you think about it now, and tell me if I'm wrong, the status that is attributed to joining the Indian Administrative Service is much less than it probably was 50 years ago. I mean, if we'd been sitting in this room with people your age then, I mean, I imagine everyone would have wanted to go to the IAS and do the exam. And I'm sure that's not the case now. So, you know, I think it's not clear which is the cart and the horse. I mean, presumably Samsung has a lot of prestige, but it's a sort of monopsony really in that. So the minute you have other entrants, you might get, and then you get sorts of risk trade-offs. So my son is now 22, he's just just graduated, he's looking for a job. And what I see is that, yes, they're prestigious things. He might like to go and work for Google or Apple or whatever, but there are also lots of sort of risk and other trade-offs in operation. And, you know, in the sort of quite innovative economies, you've got venture, you've got private equity, there are lots of companies that come up, they fail, but some of them actually will end up being successful. So kids are making much more of a bet on that. And that's also related to how they view the labor market and their own likely position in it. So again, 50 years ago, probably the equivalent of you would have thought, I'll get in the IS and that'll be the only job I have. Whereas I don't know whether it's true here, but I noticed in the UK, no one has that proposition at all. And our government is so hopeless that you wouldn't want to be a civil servant trying to tell them not to be so bloody stupid anymore, because they wouldn't listen. Anyhow, that's another point. I shouldn't bring politics into it, but can't resist. So we'll see how Mr. Sunak manages in all of that, but I wish him a lot of good luck. He'll need it. Yes, Naveen, all of your points were really very interesting. One about, you know, contrasting Adani, Ambani and the like and finance. I think there's a life cycle element to this. When companies, business groups are being constructed, they're like, they just stick their bills in everything, if you know what I mean. An opportunity comes up, they take it. The politician gives them access. We saw, for instance, when the Rajapaksa guy was overthrown, it came out that, you know, Modi was on the phone to him, telling him to give one of the port concessions to Adani. So you just take the things that come from that, and then you construct it. And at that point, you start organizing the complexity of the pyramid structure, but you also, in some cases, get rid of things that you don't really need anymore. But the fascinating feature which comes out of the book is that many of these groups do not naturally evolve into being less diversified. They may be less diversified than they were at an early stage in the life cycle, but they don't do just one thing or two things. They often do more. And that's because they're paybacks to these sorts of arrangements, including some of the insurance stuff. Regulatory, I agree, regulation can easily be captured, distorted. It's a very complex matter. All I know is that I can't really think of anywhere in this region that has an even adequate regulatory like competition framework. And even when they do, it's just on paper. So there's a massive way to go. Look, I mean, I don't think yeah, yes, your other question, which was related, how can you profile business groups? Are they actually investing capital and assets, as you put it, or are they just simply like vultures picking up the pieces? As I said, there's a life cycle element, and it also probably depends on the degree of proximity to power that you may have. I mean, it's probably no accident that when you are close to a dominant power, it might be a dictator, or it might be a powerful prime minister or president, you may behave differently than if you're in inverted commas, some steady state. Yeah. And that, I think, is the case. So, I mean, having said that, you know, and which it joins up to your regulatory point, one of the things that comes out there, we looked at, for instance, how Ambani had got the telecom license when he started up his mobile, subsequently Jio. Well, he acquired a license. The judgment was given by the Adjudicator General or whatever of the country. He basically acquired a small scale operation for very limited spectrum and for limited operations on it, which he then basically just transformed into an instrument for a full spectrum use model. Again, that's a sort of form of regulatory capture or regulatory manipulation, because actually the asset that was acquired to enable him to do that, which was a small company, was obviously a proxy company. And in a reasonably well-functioning regulatory arrangement, that would ex post have been found to have been illegal. It wasn't, and you now see the consequences. Anyhow, look, I've not done justice to many of these questions, but thank you very much, Fred.
Thank you very much. I have to, on behalf of the Vice Chancellor, staff of the university.
Oh, thank you.
There are 12 stripes, 12 schools. So they have different colors. And there we are. We're going to pose for the photograph.
Right.
Rajkumar will want to know, I not only gave you the scarf, but in South Indian style, I draped it on you.
Right. Very good.
Okay.
Thank you very much,
Have a look at
Sebastian. Yeah, okay. Yeah, we'll have a look.
Thank you.
Yes.
So, and there's this is because Naveen Jindal got the citizens of India the right to fly the flag.
Okay, great. All right. Well, the scarf will prove very useful as I head back into Delhi to deter all incoming particulate matter, of which there is a vast amount, as I found.
So thank you all for coming.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot.